Now, Gordon Brown once slipped over his words in the House of Commons and claimed he'd save the world during the financial crisis. Remember that. But now, 13 years after leaving office, he's still as driven by a need to solve the world's problems. He's co-written a book called Permacrisis, which identifies a series of problems facing the world and some possible solutions. I've been speaking to him about that, but as you'll see, we had a pretty wide-ranging interview from Net Zero and Suella Braverman to HS2 and GB News.
By permacrisis, we mean you just look around the world. You've had a COVID crisis, a climate crisis, you've got debt, recessions, you've got wars. And I wanted, and the other authors, Mohammed El-Erian and Michael Spence, we wanted to give people hope that things can be done, that things can change, that things can get better, and that the desolation and desperation at the moment can pass if we do the right things. But yes, what's changed in the last 10 years, maybe even in the last 5 years, is that we're now dealing with not just common problems or shared problems, we're dealing with global problems that cannot be solved. Climate change, infectious diseases, financial stability, they cannot be solved without coordinated global action. And what's really sad is that the gap, if you like, between the need for that action and people's willingness to do it is so big, probably bigger than at any time since 1945. So what we're suggesting is, look, here are positive solutions to some of the problems, but you need to get together to actually make them work.
Today, Rishi Sunak has given the green light to one of the largest untapped oil and gas fields, Rosebank. Is that something you support?
Well, I think what you've got to think of is, are you going to be cutting carbon emissions over the next few years? And you've got to say that you're taking measures to do that. If you are, you're still using oil. So the question is whether the oil comes from Saudi Arabia or from another oil producer, or whether it comes from the North Sea. And when you look at Britain's balance of payments position, it's far better for the oil to come from the North Sea than to come from Saudi Arabia.
So you actually think Rosebank maybe, for our own energy security...
I don't think this should be an ideological issue, because you must say that you've got a plan to cut carbon emissions. I think that's the problem that he's got, that he announced proposals on electric cars that were to be delayed, he announced proposals on heating pumps to be delayed, and I think people doubt whether he can meet the targets that he set. If you're serious about cutting carbon emissions, and we can do it, then it doesn't seem to me to be an ideological question if you've got to use some oil, where that oil comes from, and surely it is far better for it to come from Britain at the benefit to our balance of payments, even if we're selling it abroad, rather than from Saudi Arabia. So I do think there's a common sense solution to this. And of course, there's jobs in the North Sea. You've got to always be aware, you know, when you're making big changes, and we are making big changes, look what happened to the mining industry and the damage that was done to so many families when we pulled out of coal, and we didn't do the transition properly. Now we've got a transition from oil and gas, and you really have got to bear in mind that there are livelihoods also dependent on what happens in the North Sea, and particularly in Aberdeen and the North East, but it goes right down to the North East of England. And so we should be aware that you've got to give a proper transition for people in these jobs.
Another big global issue is migration. You know, the fact we've got a world on the move. We had the Suella Braverman speech yesterday that many people criticised because of the language that was used, the existential threat, as she put it, of uncontrolled migration. But is she right that we should start talking about what it means to have...
but her policy is completely wrong. Look, if you go to Africa, and I've visited most of the African countries over my time, African population is 1.2 billion at the moment. It will be 2.5 billion, twice as much in 30 years' time. Africa will be 25% of the world's population. Now, are you going to say to people in Africa that your only hope of getting a decent standard of living is migrating to the rest of the world, and particularly to Europe? Or are you going to say, we will help you in Africa and enable you to produce jobs, to produce products that can be sold, to get your agricultural sorted out, and Africa's still a net importer of food. So you've got to have a policy to help those people who, if they think they're going to be better off poor in a rich country than rich in a poor country, then the pressures for migration will grow. But if we are able to support Africa in its economic development...
So it's aid, things like that you think...
It's partly aid, but it's partly helping the economic development of these countries. I mean,
looking at the UK, because it feels to me like the big challenge for whoever wins the next election is how to balance the kind of creaking public services that many people say are crying out for investment with an economy that, as you say, is low growth, high levels of debt. What should you do?
Well, we need to back the clusters of economic growth. You know, we've got some great innovation. I mean, I go around.
What does that mean? Does that mean investment? Does that mean spending and not being scared about debt in the right areas?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. You need to encourage investment in the right places. So if you take, for example, precision medicine in Glasgow, or if you take video games industry in Dundee, and that's Scotland, then you take renewable industries in the northeast, we have got to back these industries and give them the support that is necessary. Now, that's helping training people for these jobs. It's supporting research and development so that we are the most innovative and most competitive in the world. And, of course, it's better infrastructure. And, of course, it's not helped if you cancel projects that are important to the growth. Yes, important to the growth of the north and the northeast, and important eventually to Scotland and Wales, because you're actually opening up the whole economy. The problem about the infrastructure decisions we're making is it's become a political football. I mean, if you agree for 10 years, 13 years, the Conservative government has said they're going to build HS2.
Labour hasn't committed to building it either.
Hold on. They've said they would build it for 13 years that they've been in government, and then suddenly you scrap it. Then there is no long-term planning for our infrastructure. I mean, high-speed rail is far more stronger in the continent of Europe than it is in Britain. I remember President...
So should Keir Starmer commit to building it any time?
Well, I remember President Mitterrand...
Come on, I've asked twice now. Give us an answer.
I remember...
Come on.
I will answer, of course, but I remember President Mitterrand saying that the Channel Tunnel opened up two worlds of travel. He said high-speed travel from Paris to Calais and then cross the Channel. And then he said a chance to have a leisurely look at the English countryside. And he was making fun of our inability to invest in infrastructure projects. Now, it's up to Keir Starmer what he does, but I think the issue is, are we going to take a long-term view, both about infrastructure and about the energy transition?
I was very struck by some comments you made recently in Edinburgh. I mean, you've spoken a lot about child poverty, but you talk about benefits there specifically. You said the truth is you can't live on the benefits that you receive at the moment. People are so embarrassed by their poverty that they try and hide it, but they can't in the end hide it from children who are going to school without proper clothes. So what do you want to see here? There's obviously the 2-child limit on child benefit.
I'm seeing poverty. I grew up in a town that faced the decline of the mining industry and the decline of the textile industry, and I saw poverty as I grew up. And I didn't think I would ever see it again. And this is worse poverty, and it's happening in a whole range of different communities. Not just because of loss of jobs, but because of low pay. So you're getting people working all hours and then having to queue up at a food bank because they can't make ends meet. You've got children going to school ill-clad and hungry, as I was saying there. And, of course, families choosing between heating, eating, and indeed keeping clean because they can't afford even the hygiene goods that are necessary, from toothpaste to soap and shampoo, to keep themselves going. So we've got to do something about it. And as far as I'm concerned, we cannot allow a whole generation of children to grow up. And that's why it seems we've got a levelling down strategy at the moment, not a levelling up strategy. And if it's confirmed by this north-south divide, then it makes it even worse. So I think we need a fundamental review, root and branch review of universal credit. You know, that is an essential element of looking at why are 4 million children now in poverty? Why is that going to rise to 5 million if we do nothing about it? Why, for example, do half the people on benefits, half the families with children on benefits, don't get the full benefit? They're suffering deductions because they've had to take a loan to get onto the benefit in the first place, and some of them paying back 20 or 30% of their benefit each fortnight in deductions from the Department of Work and Pensions. So there are families who can't make ends meet on the benefits that are announced, but there are millions of families who are actually suffering because they don't even get the benefit.
And how about
deducted.
the 2-child policy? I mean, many
well,
people say
that must be part of a review. As far as I can see, the child poverty amongst families with 3 children is going to be about 55% of families with 3 children. And it's going to rise for families with 4 children to something like 75% of families are going to be in poverty. So you need this review. Now, there are many things that have happened over the last 15 years, really, well, since 2010. You've got the bedroom tax, you've got the 2-child rule, you've got the cap on benefits, you've got the housing benefit not being paid in full, you've got these deductions I'm talking about. All these things have got to be taken into account to look at what is a fairer benefit system for the future.
And just finally, another big story today, a bit of a different tone, if you like. GB News has suspended Lawrence Fox and Dan Wootton for misogynistic comments that were made on air. I'm not going to repeat them. Ofcom is investigating the broadcasting watchdog. It's been criticised before as not being effectively been pretty toothless. What's your own experience of Ofcom?
Well, I criticised Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross when similar remarks were made almost, 15 years ago. And it led to changes in the way the programmes were done at that time. But I think we've got to look very carefully at GB News and all these broadcast companies that are emerging, because we've got a far wider range of broadcasters, and the system of regulation is not good enough to cope with it. So Ofcom needs to have more teeth to deal with standards, issues of standards. And of course, you've got this amazing situation now. You've got internet, you've got television, you've got newspapers, and you have a completely different system of regulation for each of them. But everybody is influenced by all these social medias at one and the same time. So I think you've got to standardise some of the regulation, and certainly you can't allow people to appear on air and talk about women in the way that they're doing, and without any propriety. These people have got to be kept off the air. They just cannot be allowed. I'm not in favour of censorship, but you cannot have this fall in standards and allow it to continue.